Welcome to City Cinematheque, where the art and pleasure of the movies are the subject of serious discussion. I'm your host, Jerry Carlson, and I teach film studies at the City College of the City University of New York. Today we continue our series, Soviet Literary Adaptations, and we're going to be screening the 1979 production, The Shooting Party, directed by Emile Lontenu and based upon an early novel by Anton Chekhov. It's a rich literary adaptation with a number of surprises and a lush visual style. We'll be talking about that and a number of other things after today's screening. Please join us as I bring to City Cinematheque Professor Anthony Anemone from the New School, a noted specialist on Russian literature and film. Now, take this journey to pre-revolutionary Russia in The Shooting Party. Welcome back to City Cinematheque. I hope you've enjoyed this rare screening of The Shooting Party, a highly regarded film at the time of its release, now over 30 years ago. And you'd have to say it's the lesser path to Chekhov, because this is not an adaptation of one of the major plays, but it's an adaptation of an early novel. There's a lot to talk about. This is rich territory, and I'm pleased to say that we have here today Professor Anthony Anemone to be chatting with us. Tony teaches Russian language, literature, and cinema at the New School, where he also serves as the Associate Dean for Faculty Affairs. Previously, he was the Chair of Foreign Languages and Literatures at the College of William and Mary. And he's actually a specialist in modern Russian literature, cinema, and culture, and is the editor of a just-published book from Northwestern University Press, Just Assassins, The Culture of Terrorism in Russia. And for the future, he's translating the notebooks and diaries of Daniil Karms, a well-known poet and prose writer of the avant-garde and one of the creators of Russia's native literature of the absurd in the 1920s and the 1930s. Welcome, Tony. Pleasure to have you here.
Thank you very much, Jerry. It's my pleasure.
Great. You know, when people come to the cinema to see Chekhov, it's far more likely that they're going to be seeing something like an adaptation of Uncle Vanya or The Three Sisters. The Shooting Party is not that well known. So let's just start off with what this actual literary, property, as we would say, this novel is. Where does it fit within Chekhov's development and in the canon of Chekhov?
Right. Well, it's a great question, Jerry. It's an early novel. Actually, it's the only novel that Chekhov ever wrote. He spent his entire life basically feeling a little bit deficient for not being able to complete another novel. But it was written when he was 24, so it really can be considered part of his sort of juvenilia. Interestingly, it was never republished by Chekhov throughout his entire life. He republished many of his early works, but this was one that never came back, which suggests that he was really not very happy with the work itself.
Okay. And in terms of it and where it fit, I mean, is this a kid, if I can call Anton Chekhov a kid, at 24, who's trying to, fit in with the highest reaches of his literary culture, or is this somebody who's just trying to write something that's going to get himself published? And how does it fit into the popular culture, or the high culture of his moment?
Right. It's a complicated question, and really the answer is yes to all of those things.
Okay.
On the simplest level, it was a piece that was serialized in a newspaper, in a popular newspaper, a newspaper that paid very badly, actually. But it was serialized as a kind of boulevard, novel, a page turner. And, it's basically a kind of proto-crime novel.
Right.
This is a period where throughout Europe and in Russia, the crime novel, the early detective novels were very, very popular. And Chekhov is clearly trying to tie into this larger element or larger direction in popular literature. But interestingly, it is Chekhov. He's young, and he has much greater ambitions than this. So the novel is actually quite interesting in ways because it is just full of allusions and reminiscences of the great classic authors of classical Russian literature. Pushkin, Dostoevsky, Tolstoy, and really, in some ways, Pushkin and Dostoevsky are real touchstones for this novel. And that creates a kind of unusual and maybe uncomfortable and unsuccessful kind of combination of high and low in this work. which may be part of the reason why Chekhov himself was never that happy with the work and forgot about it and ignored it for the rest of his life.
Right, right. But the interesting point here is that he is somebody who continues to then publish short stories, very, very widely throughout his career. So the notion of reaching this broadest popular audience at the same time, retaining his ambition to be part of the most regarded culture of Russia is there, and obviously he's working in theater as a popular medium throughout. So it's a very interesting moment in which, in a certain sense, he's trying on a genre, right, the novel, that whatever his sense is not going to work out for him.
Right.
Whereas two others, the short story and the theater, he has, if I may say so, an eternal place in the canon of those genres.
Right. I think it was a real learning experience for Chekhov. I think he understood at the end of the work that the way to become a member of the classics, the way to become a classic, is not by imitating some of the external themes, characters, situations that you would find in Dostoevsky, for example. That the kind of heavily ideological and even religious kind of background of works by, say, Dostoevsky and Tolstoy were not really what he was interested in or what he was good at. So it's an attempt to sort of try out a kind of serious literary style. I think Chekhov discovers or learns that it's not really set for him. And in the next few years, he develops his own approach to the serious themes of Russian society and Russian literature. It's a much more neutral, objective stance than you would expect to see in, again, Dostoevsky or Tolstoy. And that is the stance that Chekhov has become famous for, and that we see in his short stories. And his plays. And I should say also, it's interesting that Chekhov in the West, still is seen as essentially a playwright who also wrote in other genres. In Russia, it's actually quite the opposite. He's really a short story. He's the greatest short story writer who also wrote some very interesting plays in his last few years of his life. And it makes an interesting difference in the way we see him. Absolutely.
And of course, as a very early work, this is when he's using certain tropes, and then the most obvious one is that the country home is something that both precedes Chekhov in the literature, gathering people at some particular place and kind of putting them under the microscope, and that then in the plays becomes a major aspect of that, the limited theatrical space and bringing people in there to examine the society itself. And here you can feel, from what you've described the novel, there's this uncomfortable, mixture of that with, does this proto Agatha Christie, take them all out to the country estate and kill somebody and then do it? But the mixture's a little bit uneven. But that in itself can be the attractiveness of someone to make an adaptation. Because if you have a great master like Chekhov, but you have, let's say, a less achieved work or an earlier work, well, then that means the act of selecting and reshaping those materials for another medium perhaps gives you more freedom than if you're coming up with a canonical work such as Lady with a Dog from the short story genre, or say The Three Sisters, or the Cherry Orchard from the canon of the theater.
No, that's absolutely right. When you make a movie of a work that is canonical, the audience expects to see the work as they have imagined it.
Right.
They all know the work. If you take something that's lesser known, it gives the director clearly much more freedom. It's interesting. There are some other advantages of this work to be adapted by a filmmaker, and it's interesting that you mentioned Agatha Christie, because this novel really can be seen in that sort of school. The trick ending is something that you might expect from Agatha Christie. The author of the work, which includes the sort of evidence which needs to be interpreted, is presented by the criminal himself, and the strange non-detective detective. I mean, the editor of the newspaper who's publishing his work really plays the role of the detective. And I might just mention here also, it's interesting, when we first meet the editor in his office, he's standing, or sitting and then standing underneath a very famous portrait of Fyodor Dostoevsky.
Absolutely.
And it's very interesting because I think in this sense the director is telling us that he understands and he is sort of playing on this going back to the sort of metaphysical murder novels of Dostoevsky, Crime and Punishment in particular. It's interesting also, the editor really looks like Dostoevsky. Did you notice that as well?
Yeah, yes, yeah. Thank you for saying that, because I had that moment of ambivalence in looking at the film. I said, wait, is that looks like Dostoevsky up there, but the editor's clearly not Dostoevsky, you know. Right. So, and I'm going to push it even, you know, just one, you know, 1 meter in another direction, that you have in this scene, you have these 3 bearded, brown to red-haired 19th century Russian men, and I don't think it's, you know, that I'm just some stupid 21st century American who says, well, they all look alike, but rather that there is this whole notion of this kind of visual rhyming of these 3 characters in the scene. I mean, they're not identical, but there's a rhyming. So that's this whole thing of this fragmentation of the personality. I mean, the whole, you know, there's this analytical section to the personality, there's this literary section to the personality, or cultured, and then there's this, you know, animalistic that we eventually get because there's a murderer. Right, in the room. So it really sets up a kind of interesting visual ambiguity to me. And at first, in the first shot of the editor, I said, well, what? No, that's not the protagonist.
Right.
But there's a momentary, you know, ambiguity that I think is functional in it.
Well, it's very interesting, yeah. The editor, in a sense, is supplying one of the aspects of Kamyshev, the criminal, the magistrate, which in the novel, for example, does not exist. That is his conscience. That is his guilt. The narrator is, as you quite rightly point out, he is the analytical, you know, consciousness in this text. And it's very interesting when you actually get into the story, when we get into the past life of Kamyshev and the Count, Korneyev and Olga, there is this very strong emphasis on the Slavic soul, the Slavic mind that is sentimental and romantic, passionate, but it's not reasonable. It's not rational.
Right. Absolutely.
As his hanger-on friend at one point mentions. So I think it is very interesting, you know, the point precisely that you made out, that at the beginning this is kind of figured for us in this opening scene.
Yeah, and what's very interesting about that also is that I'm so fascinated that you talk about that irrationality, because once we get into the flashback story that's being narrated, of course, you know, it's the Count who has come to die at the estate, and in this way of defying all the rationality of the scientific delivery of the evidence that he's going to die soon given to him by this, he's going to be in rejection, in denial of that, or in this kind of, you know, festive, but Slavically festive, you know, way, and yet he's not the one who ends up dead in the story.
Right. He ends up going to the funeral of Kamyshev. Right. He's one of the 2 people.
Yeah, absolutely. And not to mention the fact that Olga, who becomes this, who when they arrive is the very embodiment of this kind of spirit of life of the young woman. Is she even human, or is she almost like a woodland spirit as she's first treated visually in the film?
Well, let me say a word about the Count before we go on
please.
to Olga, because I think, you know, when we start talking about rational and sentimental, the Count is obviously a central character, interesting here. He's also a character who's centrally involved in the kind of surrealistic air of this film.
Yeah, very good point.
And again, part of, I think, this sort of anti-rationalist basis in that we see in the film. It's interesting because Chekhov is usually considered the most rational Russian writers, while, you know, a Dostoevsky or a Tolstoy, you know, one can understand the kind of battle between mysticism and reason in their works. But Chekhov is usually seen as a pretty straightforward.
He's the good doctor.
He's a member of the what did they used to call it, the reality community?
Yeah.
So he's interesting in that way as well, because he's kind of part of this, I have to say, rather cliched notion of the Russian mentality. You know, he comes back to his estate, because the doctors have told him that he'll die if he doesn't stop drinking, and of course, what does he do as soon as he comes back? But he starts drinking.
You bet.
So clearly this is very involved with him. But it's interesting that the director takes this aspect of the character in an interesting direction, which is to include any number of scenes where there is no realistic motivation for what's happening, and there's a bit of sort of the style seems to be overcoming the actual events. This has to do largely with the Gypsies, but maybe we should talk about Olga and move to the Gypsies, or should we?
No. Let's talk about Olga, because I think they're all linked, because there is this quality. There's this irrational quality that is combined into any number of scenes, but also into any number of characters. So even with Olga, there's the question of is she somehow more closely linked with nature? I mean that she has something. I mean, we see her literally hugging a tree, and with the June bug, and yet late in the film she's capable of a kind of analytic discourse about her economic situation, and how, well, the woods are lovely, but I don't want to live there, anymore. So what do you make of her as a character, as represented in the film?
Right. Well, she clearly begins the film as this sort of ideal vision of a kind of wild child, a kind of girl of nature. We see her dress. The red dress is interesting. It's a kind of ambiguous type of symbol that hints at passion as well. But we see her with the bird. We see her running in the outdoors. She's usually filmed outdoors. We see her on horseback. We see her just running around in a kind of very sort of youthful and exuberant way, and we see her in the rain. And all of these scenes, and the ones you mentioned, when she's most upset, when she has finally figured out the errors of marrying the elderly Orbanian, she hugs a tree, and we see, I think it's a ladybug on her hand. So all of this is clearly true. So she starts out, clearly as the sort of embodiment of a natural woman, a natural child. And in the novel, this is maybe a little bit clearer than in the movie, but this is what attracts her to our hero, or our anti-hero, Kamyshev. He is a kind of jaded, cynical soul who is living in the country, doesn't really feel that there's any particular outlet for his talents and his desires. So he sort of, hangs out at home, he gets drunk with the Count, he's really got no direction. But she represents real life for him. And in the movie, this is very clear what a powerful force she is. I mean, she basically turns three men towards her. But as we go on in the movie, clearly she changes. I mean, clearly she turns into, she comes down from the sort of ideal pedestal that she has sort of placed herself, and we find out about her when she starts talking. She's rather simple. She's a little bit of a fantasist. She talks about the heavenly electricity. She talks about how she would like to die. And that, we see her as a kind of young person, so we might be willing to forgive some of these not particularly intelligent things. But as things go on, it's clear that she wants to escape rural poverty. She wants a man who has money and a man who has rank, who will raise her in society. And the real tragedy for her is that she guesses wrong. She makes the wrong rational calculation at the beginning, that is to marry this former aristocrat who now has been reduced through financial reasons to the role of a simple functionary in the estate of the Count. And it's not long after she's married, actually it can probably be measured in a few minutes, where she understands that she's sort of put her stake on the wrong horse, and that she could have done something like Kamyshev. Later on, well, I should say that at that moment, she shows herself, it's a very interesting moment for her, because she shows herself to be, number one, completely willing to go on in life with a husband and a lover. And when the lover says, "Run away with me," she says, "What will people say?" So she's afraid of the sort of common slander, common opinions, and that's not a very attractive feature. But then the worst part of this, the worst moment in this scene occurs when she has she's walked away from the Count, whose wife has just reappeared. She's clearly very unhappy with the relationship. She meets up with Kamyshev in the woods, and he's twirling her around, and she says, "What a fool I was, what a mistake I made to marry Orbanian." And everyone, including Kamyshev, expects her to say, "I should have married you, I should have waited." And she says, if I had waited, I could have married the Count. He would have divorced as well.
Right, no, it's a wonderful moment.
Right, it's a real, so at that point, she's really traveled a really great distance from this kind of wild child of nature to a very pragmatic, and the words that Kamyshev uses, he basically calls her the equivalent of a prostitute, someone who sold herself to men at this point.
Absolutely the case. So what do you make, with all of this, what do you make of the fact that there's this presence of the Gypsies, and how do the Gypsies relate to these themes of nature or of mysticism or all of that? Because when you say Chekhov, if we're playing one of those little quizzes, what's the next word that comes to your mind? When you say Chekhov, most people don't say Gypsies.
Right, exactly. Yeah, no. The Gypsies are a critical aspect of 19th century Russian culture in general. They really begin in Russian literature with Pushkin, so we're talking about the 1830s or so, where they become a critical symbol for Russian Romanticism of natural people, free people, people who reject the conventions of society, who refuse to live in cities, who travel around, who do what they will, etc.
Yeah.
And as such, they become heroes and ideals to the kind of tortured intellectuals who are bound to work and to country and to government and maybe to family. So they are an ideal of freedom and escape.
Right.
And that sort of exists for decades in Russian. It's used by many Russian writers from Pushkin, Lermontov as well. But by the end of the century, it's very interesting. By the time you get to Dostoevsky, for example, the Gypsies have changed. I mean, they're part of the kind of dissolute culture of the end of the 19th century. They're associated with singing, with thievery. That is, they're always begging for big tips when they're singing for you, and essentially their women are seen as prostitutes in a sense. So they're part of the kind of dissolute lifestyle that we see in writers like Dostoevsky. They're parts of criticism. As you get to the sort of fin de siècle, and Tolstoy and Chekhov's period, you see more of that.
Yeah.
That is, they are clearly an accessory to the outmoded lifestyle of the rich aristocracy. And in this book and in this movie, this plays with these images of the Gypsies. You were quite right to say that Olga is associated with nature, and in that sense, she is part of this traditional sort of romantic notion that we see in Russia with the Gypsies. But the Gypsies in the rest of the movie are very strange. They're this sort of, the women are dressed in these white, spotless outfits. They're this chorus. They come from Moscow to perform. And while the book is actually rather graphic, especially for 19th century literature, about what Kamyshev does with his friends, with his friend Tina, for example, the movie is much more puritanical about this. The Gypsies really are there to sing and to dance and to allow us a kind of psychological insight into the mentality, into the cliched Russian mentality of people like Karenev and Kamyshev. That is, they drink. And they don't get drunk just like, frat boys. They get drunk in order to express their desires, their unhappiness,
it's a loosening.
Their emotions. And the Gypsies are the necessary sort of accompaniment to this. They're what allows this to happen. There's one great moment when the Count is very depressed, and he puts his hand on his head, and he says, "Give me something sad." He says to the Gypsies, and they start playing their song. So you see the relationship between what the Gypsies do and the sort of emotional states of the characters very clearly here.
Last question, and that is, why this adaptation at this time?
Right. Well, I think there are two important reasons. There are probably some other reasons as well, but there are at least two important ones. One is that in the 1970s, actually, let me start with the other one. The basic Marxist point of view about a writer like Chekhov is that Chekhov is one of the people who saw most clearly the inevitable decline of the pre-revolutionary Russian society. And he saw the decline through analyses and observations of the kind of decadent aristocrats like Count Karenev. One can also say through the kind of amoralism of a character like Kamyshev, people for whom the rational aspect of has become replaced by this kind of desire or this kind of obsession with love or sex. or just the sort of desolate, drunkenness of the Count. Right?
Yeah.
So that's one of the things. Chekhov is a very convenient writer for Marxists, and throughout the Soviet period, because his works were adapted before the 70s as well, but throughout the Soviet period, he's a great writer to take because you can set up very clearly the sort of story of individuals in trouble with the story of society.
You need to do point two because we're running out of time.
And the second one is that the Soviet government by the 70s is running out of commitment from the people, and one way of gaining is by adopting the prestige of the classics. So if you put the classics on, people will associate the classics with your view of the world and with your government. And in a world where the sort of utopian project of the Soviets was no longer believed by people,
right,
the classics provide a way to align the government with the people. And I think that's one of the important issues here as well.
Great, and that's a great point to end, and by coincidence, we have to. We have to end. If you'd like more information about City Cinematheque, or more generally about the programming at City University Television, please visit our website. Our address is www.cuny.tv. You'll find there click-ons that give descriptions of all of our program. You'll also find click-ons to communicate with us. We'd love to hear from you about your comments, or if you prefer, you can also give us your email and we can put you on the e-list for City Cinematheque. So please visit www.cuny.tv. Tony, a very, very fast and rich 30 minutes. Thank you for joining us here, and I hope you're going to be back on City Cinematheque when we visit Slavic lands again.
Thank you very much, Jerry. Really, it was a great pleasure.
Okay, my pleasure. And thank you for joining us here on City Cinematheque as we stroll through the archives of film history. Please join us in coming weeks when we do so again. In any case, thanks for being here today. Bye-bye for now.